In addition to Unitarian Universalism, paganism is the other main thread of religion I practice. I have been a teacher of pagan spirituality and religion for a little over 20 years now, and this means that over the course of my career, I've had a lot of time to observe larger patterns and currents in the adherents and explorers of pagan belief. Devotional polytheists, people who believe in and serve and worship various different gods, are part of our diaspora. And the overwhelming majority of pagans convert to paganism from something else. In most cases, that something else is a form of Christianity. In addition to that common form of conversion, paganism here in the United States is influenced by the Christian supremacist culture we are part of. A supremacist system is one where the norms of a particular culture are held up and enforced as universal or normal. Living in Christian supremacy means that even if a pagan is relatively unchurched, they often have deeply embedded ideas based on the definitions that come to us from Christianity. For example, what is a god? The Christian answer is an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present being whose wisdom and knowledge supersedes all human understanding. What you might not know is that this conception of deity is largely limited to Christianity. In most polytheistic religions, the gods are limited. They do not know everything. They are not all-powerful. They are powerful, but not without limits on power. They are not able to be everywhere all the time. They are different than humans, wiser in some ways, more capable in some ways, but not without their challenges. In most polytheistic religions, the gods can become ill, they can make mistakes, they can die. They have their own interpersonal issues, their own work they are trying to do in the world, and their own burdens to carry. The deeply embedded Christian supremacist thinking about what gods are takes root in pagan belief with all the problematic baggage that accompanies the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing deity. Adherents assume that because their lives are challenging, the gods they serve are somehow displeased with them. The guilt, shame, and victim-blaming that comes along with Christian baggage simply takes on a new form and continues in pagans. This extends to a certain kind of helplessness, this idea that prayer and offerings are the only way to solve a problem. People sometimes stay stuck when they could move, relying on an internalized misconception of the gods rather than taking responsibility for and action to support their own lives. It's difficult to step outside the culture in which we are raised. Dismantling internalized norms takes work and time. But for those of us for whom the gods are all too obviously real, this dismantling is vital work if we are going to develop a form of religion that's healthy. So we come back to the question, what is a god? So the band Florence and the Machine has a new album out that I'm like high-key obsessed with. In the song Sympathy Magic, there's this section of lyrics that I absolutely love. And a light through the window just so, and the wind through my fingers, the only God that I know, and it does not want me on my knees to believe. Interestingly, I think Florence Welch is tapping into a pagan conception of deity with those words. You see, in most, if not all, non-Christian religions, the gods are associated with the currents of nature. They embody things like the cold winter wind, the spring thunderstorms that bring life-giving rains, the first warm sunlight in spring, the work and joy of a good harvest, and the dark earth of the burial grounds. Pagan gods are not separate from the world. They are part of it, just as we are. They are born of the earth, just as we are. One answer to the question, what is a god, that I find resonant is the idea that a deity is the combination of natural forces in the landscape and the relationship those forces have with the humans who live there. In regions with extreme weather, the very far north as well as the deserts, the gods can be fierce. The human relationship with the land in those locations is fierce. In regions that are more hospitable to human life, the gods are gentler, particularly those associated with currents that are part of the agricultural cycle. So, the Norse god Thor is the force of the spring thunderstorms and vitality of the livestock as they begin the work of spring. The Greek goddess Demeter is both the abundance of the harvest and the labor that brings it forth. The Mayan god Kisin is the earthquake that destroys and reshapes the land. The light, the wind, the rain, the darkness, these strong forces still hold sway in our lives, no matter how many space heaters we run in an attempt to pretend that winter is not happening. We are still in relationship with the land where we live, whether we consciously acknowledge it or not. Another conception that comes to us from several different pagan religions involves scale. Some deities are big: the sun, the moon, the rising green of the growing season. But non-Christian conceptions of deity also include smaller gods: the mountain range nearby, the river you live near, and the forest at the edge of the settlement. Smaller doesn't mean less impactful on human lives. Those of us who live in or near a floodplain are all too aware of how much a flood can change the course of a life. Those of us who live close to the mountains understand what an earthquake or a landslide could do. Those of us who live by the ocean know that its changing moods can transform the shoreline and anything built there. If I could telepathically give everyone one concept from paganism, a more expansive and nuanced concept of deity is high on my list. If we let the gods be more complicated, more interesting, more varied, what would religion look like? How much more healthy would it be if we all co-created religion with the mysteries of this world, rather than bound ourselves to a rigid, punitive, merciless understanding of the numinous? So, what are the forces you interact with regularly? What are the natural currents that govern the land where you live? What does that mean for the way you interact with the land that you belong to? And can you create space for a wider understanding of the forces that we call gods?
James Hollis is a Jungian analyst based here in Washington, D.C., and the author of more than 20 books. I've read over half of them and found each one to be illuminating. And over the years, I've woven some of his insights into my sermons, and I suspect I'll eventually make my way through all of his work. While reading a book he published last year, I was struck by a passing remark about a much earlier volume he wrote in 1995 titled "Tracking the Gods: The Place of Myth in Modern Life." He says it may be the most important book he's ever written. But then he added something else. He said it also may be one of his least read books. Likely, he suggests, because that word myth can sometimes be scary to modern readers. At that point, I couldn't resist. Challenge accepted. I ordered it immediately. So why does that word myth make some of us wary? And why does it matter? What is lost if a culture abandons its myths? To explore those questions, I want to invite us on a journey, not backward into nostalgia, but inward and forward through three stages in our relationship to myth. For myths, rightly understood, are not childish fantasies. They are living containers of meaning. And that is why when we adopted Jalen, one of the books that I bought him and put him on a bookshelf to be read was a book of Greek myths. At 2 years old, he's not quite ready for that yet. But one day soon, I look forward to reading those stories to him and other myths from world mythology and revisiting them myself, because they carry something enduring about what it means to be human. Stories that speak to deep psychological and spiritual truths. So to understand why myth matters so deeply, let's trace how our relationship to myth has changed over time. First, there was mythology. The great stories that our ancestors told and retold, carrying them across the generations as vessels of meaning, seeking to make sense of the human condition in which we all find ourselves. Its joys and sorrows, its chaos and order, its beginnings and endings. And though they spoke of gods on mountains and forces in the sky, they were always, even if not always consciously, speaking about the depths of the human soul. And then came the rise of modern science, and we took that mythology and we put it in the laboratory. And this long process of what we nerdy academics call demythologization. Through the scientific method, the world became more measurable, predictable, explainable. And in the process, myth was often dismissed as just childish superstition, a relic of a less enlightened age, fit perhaps for children, but not for serious adults. And yet, even as science advanced, many voices attuned to the human spirit, our poets and artists and psychologists, began to sense that something essential to our shared meaning had been lost. And now we find ourselves at a threshold, a third stage, the potential for what we might call re-mythologization. Not a retreat from science, but a recognition that meaning cannot be reduced to data alone. But perhaps that is why a renowned psychoanalyst like Glasse might say that his book on myth is the most important of his more than 20 books. Without myth, we gain information, but we lose wisdom and depth and a felt connection to a larger order of meaning beyond ourselves. I'll say that just one more time. When we lose myth, we may gain information, but we lose wisdom and depth and a felt connection to a larger order beyond ourselves. Consider just one brief example of the power and insight that myth can still hold if we approach them not literally, but metaphorically, symbolically, and most importantly, archetypally. As you've heard the news this past week about our country's war of choice with Iran, can you feel in any way the sense in which Mars, the god of war, has seized the wheel of history once again? War not as a sober last resort, but as an impulsive, vainglorious force. Not Athena's disciplined strategy in the service of defense, but Ares's chaotic fury, intoxicated with his own power. That is myth, not in the sense of literal gods in the sky, but in the sense of stories that reveal enduring truths, truths that we ignore at our peril. Our Constitution, the UN Charter, international law represent our collective attempt to bind the war god, to fasten chains around Mars forged in centuries of bloodshed. They embody the accumulated wisdom of our forebears who learned at terrible cost that unrestrained power will eventually devour the very civilization that it claims to defend. So when leaders launch strikes that many experts say are neither lawful self-defense nor clearly justified, it is though we can see the chains binding Mars begin to fall away. And whenever Mars runs free, it is never the powerful who suffer most. It is the children, the elders, the poor, the ordinary people in Iran, in Israel, in Palestine, now across the region. Those who did not choose this war and yet are bearing its consequences. This is why myth matters. It names the archetypal forces that move beneath our policies, our spin, and our press releases. It reminds us that the god of war is not only a figure in ancient stories, but a pattern in the human psyche, one that when unrestrained always sacrifices the vulnerable. And we could trace similar patterns elsewhere. We might look to Narcissus, and the perils of self-absorption for those in the highest echelons of power. Or recall Cassandra, cursed to speak the truth and never be believed. And ask ourselves where urgent warnings are being dismissed in our own time. Where aren't urgent warnings being dismissed in our own time? Can you feel the power that these ancient myths still carry and still awaken? The anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss once expressed it this way: myths think themselves in us and without our knowledge. And that's because they're often acting at the unconscious level. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, I have a list of therapists that I would be glad to offer you my list of referrals. In other words, your friends and family will thank me. In other words, myths are not just stories we tell. They are expressions of the deep structures of our human mind, what Jung would later call the collective unconscious. Patterns that shape how societies organize power, how they justify violence, and how they define who is the hero and who is the enemy. Myths do not merely describe reality, they reveal recurring dynamics that surface across every culture and throughout history. The gods have different names, but it's the same archetypal dynamics. Maturity does not mean outgrowing myth. It means becoming conscious of the forces that myths point to and reveal. The real battlefield is not only geopolitical, it is psychological. It is spiritual, as in that first part of our mission statement here at UUCF, to encourage spiritual growth. Our struggle, individual and collectively, is not only out there, it is in here. It is within us. And when our elective leaders have not done their inner work, have not gone to therapy, or at least done their inner processing in whatever way needs to be done, the difficult work of examining your shadow, your wounds, why you hunger for power, it becomes easier if you haven't done that inner work to wage war on distant lands rather than confront the conflict within ourselves. We're just externalizing. Unexamined anger becomes crusade. Unexamined fear becomes doctrine that you require others to believe. Unexamined insecurity becomes war. Or to adapt a popular meme, some men would rather go to war with Iran than go to therapy. Or perhaps I should say, some leaders would rather send other people's sons and daughters to risk dying in war than do that inner work themselves of examining the wounds that so clearly drive them. And to be clear, this is not about mockery. This is about tragedy, the tragedy of great power wielded by those who live deeply unexamined lives. This is part of what Jung meant when he warned that the gods do not disappear, they go inward. Or as Jung once wrote in a letter, where did the gods go when they left Olympus? They went into the solar plexus. The gods didn't vanish, they migrated inward. Jung went on to say that when Westerners fell off the roof, so to speak, of the medieval cathedral, when they could no longer believe literally in the doctrines of the church, they did not land, Jung said, they didn't land in a bright field of pure reason. That's the lie we told ourselves. Instead, we fell into the abyss of ourselves. You do not see the world as it is, you see the world as you are. The forces that we once imagined up on Mount Olympus and across the countless pantheons, they now live in the depths of the human psyche. And when they remain unconscious, they do not retire quietly. They act themselves out in our lives and our history. The problem with the unconscious is that it's unconscious, but we can become more conscious of it if we pay attention. Hollis argues that this movement, from a cosmos filled with gods to an interior landscape of the self, that is one of the defining shifts of what it meant to move from the pre-modern to the modern world. What we earlier called demythologization, the stripping away of our shared mythic frameworks that where it once felt easier to believe literally. Whether we're talking about Roman gods or Christian doctrines or other sacred stories, it just used to be able to believe those things literally. It used to be easier to. That did not simply clear the air for science and reason. It also severed our felt connection to the cosmos, to something larger than ourselves. The gods did not disappear. They no longer gather in temples. They gather in our nervous systems. Take just a moment for that to sink in. You can feel it in your body if you start to notice. The lightning in your chest when breaking news flashes across your phone, the surge of heat when somebody says the wrong thing at dinner, the quickening pulse that whispers, "Fight." That is not Zeus hurling lightning bolts from the sky. That is archetypal energy moving through your muscle and body and breath. And when enough people are moved by that same unconscious energy at once, history itself begins to shift. Which is why Hollis insists that the task before us is nothing less than becoming more conscious of the unconscious forces at work within us. And when we undertake that inner work, this is the key part. We become less dangerous to ourselves and less dangerous to others. Less likely to project our wounds outward or let unconscious forces steer our lives. When individuals refuse that responsibility, they do not become free. That's another of those big lies. You just become susceptible. And when whole societies evade that burden, they do not become stronger, they become vulnerable. Vulnerable to projection, vulnerable to demagogues who manipulate us through fear and grievance, vulnerable to the seduction of simple answers. One measure of our individual and national maturity is whether we are willing to shoulder the burden of doing our inner work, or whether we will continue searching for a savior, a strong man, or an ideology that promises to relieve us of the responsibilities of self-governance. Hollis reminds us that no one, no guru, no ideology can save us from the complexity and ambiguity of life. Anyone trying to save you from the complexity and ambiguity of life is selling you something for their benefit. That truth applies not only to individuals, but to democracies as well. A democracy, after all, is a profoundly adult system of governance. It assumes that we, the people, are capable of wrestling with complexity. At the moment, we have not shown ourselves up to that task. It assumes we can tolerate disagreement. It assumes we can live without absolute certainty. It assumes we are willing to take responsibility for the myths that move through us rather than projecting them onto our enemies as scapegoats or saviors. When we refuse that responsibility, we regress. We are tempted by simpler stories in which we are always innocent, others are wholly guilty, and violence begins to look redemptive. But anyone who has spent much time with the ancient myths know that they resist such simplicity. The ancient myths are as complex and conflicted as the human condition itself. And when we begin to take mythology seriously again, not as literal truth, but as metaphor, symbol, and archetype, pointing beyond themselves to the deepest mysteries of reality. Something subtle but powerful happens, something, again, that scholars call re-mythologization. The re-enchantment of the cosmos, not through literal belief, but through awakened consciousness. Not a return to superstition, but a return to meaning. Instead of being driven unconsciously by Mars or Narcissus or by any of the many archetypal forces that move through us, we begin to recognize them for what they are. Oh, hey Mars, I see you. I don't have to punch that dude in the face, right? Hey Narcissus, I see you. This isn't just about me. Other people matter too, right? We begin to recognize these forces for what they are and find the ability to choose how we will respond. That is not weakness. It is maturity. It is actual freedom. And in such moments, we may yet glimpse the divine, not as a superhuman figure descending from the sky, but as a sacred depth within us that resonates with a larger mystery beyond us, emerging through the simple yet profound act of being ourselves, authentically, consciously, courageously. So the question before us is not whether the gods are real in the literal sense, again, of superhuman beings in the sky, but whether we will relate consciously to the mysterious, archetypal energies toward which the myths have always pointed. Mars will always be available to us in nations, in neighborhoods, in headlines, in our own heated conversations. The archetypes don't disappear. The question is whether they possess us or whether we will meet them as consciously as we are able. Democracy depends on that maturity. It depends on citizens willing to bear the burden of meaning, resist the seduction of simple myths, and to choose compassion over fear-driven reactivity. And each of us, in our own small but significant spheres of influence, is called to the same task: to live our lives, wherever we find ourselves, to live our lives as fully as possible while remaining linked to the larger mystery of this reality in which we find ourselves. That is how we bind Mars, within us and within our nations. That is how we serve the mystery, and that perhaps is how we glimpse the mystery, not in the sky above, but in the hard and holy work of becoming more fully human together. The gods will always move through human history. They always have. The question again is whether they possess us or whether we will meet them with consciousness, compassion, and courage. I am grateful to be on that journey, not alone, but with all of you. Let me give you just one more recapitulation of this move from mythology to demythologization to remythologization. How many of you remember that 1993 film Big Fish? It was directed by Tim Burton, starring Ewan McGregor. If I had to give you one homework assignment, it would be go home and watch that film, especially if you haven't seen it in a while and don't remember it. I won't tell you anything beyond like what's revealed in the first 5 minutes, but the gist of it is that Ewan McGregor, his character, had grown up with his father being someone who told big fish tales. You know what those are, these kind of big stories. But he believed them all, right? So that he grew up with this mythology of these magical stories that happened to his father. And then he grew up and he realized that the fish wasn't this big. The fish was this big, right? But it had grown in the telling. And so he became really disillusioned, and he left home, and he became a journalist, and he became a really just the facts ma'am journalist. But that's where the story starts, is that his father's dying. And he hasn't seen us, he's become estranged from his father, but he comes back, and on his deathbed, he and his father are wrestling with this, what is true and what isn't true. And as his father's dying and they're having these conversations, the movie is about him investigating, maybe this fish actually wasn't this big. Maybe it was actually this big, and wrestling with all of this. And you get to watch the world becoming magical again, not in a literal way, but in an archetypal and symbolic and metaphor. It's a really beautiful exploration of what we've been talking about. And for any of you who grew up Christian, I'll end with this, that, I grew up thinking that being told that the Genesis myth was, that these myths were true, right? In this literal sense, that, that the universe began with 2 Hebrew-speaking humans and a talking snake, right? It turns out that's not the case. I don't think I'm disillusioning anybody to say that I think you can pretty safely say that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, from the creation story through the Tower of Babel, that's all myth. But you could demythologize it first. I don't think you have any chance of saying there's any historical kernel till you get to Abraham. Some people would say not until you get to David. We don't have time for that. But I think what you can do is say those first 11 chapters, they're just myth. And you can just dismiss them, and then we should just throw them out. Or you can come to see, you can demythologize. Or you can come to remythologize and say, just to take one of the stories, take the Garden of Eden story, to say, that never happened, but it always happens. It's happened in every one of our lives. That we were at first naked and innocent, running around like my 2-year-old, naked and unashamed, right? But one day, he's going to get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. I'm going to protect him as long as I can. But one day, just like Adam and Eve got kicked out, that never happened, but it always happens in every one of our lives. And that's the archetype of myth that we're invited not to miss.
So as you go out to the rest of today and into the rest of this week, continue your journey with love at the center. Care for one another, care for this one earth, do justice, and make peace. And as you go, whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of even just a little more hope or love or peace or joy, that goes with you out into the world. We are different for having spent this time together. And even in this very hard time in our world, continue to look for and savor all that still remains good and true and beautiful. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.